Is the death penalty biblical? Part 2. Back in the early 1980s, when I was studying criminal justice and government and politics at the University of Maryland, College Park, just outside, a few miles from Washington, D.C., I was walking back from class with my professor. I think his name was Dr. Wolverson, if I remember correctly, going back a lot of years. He was also an attorney, an active attorney, a working attorney. I think he was a criminal attorney, and certainly was a defense attorney. We started discussing the death penalty, and he said to me, Stephen, the American public, American people are at a crossroads, and they have to decide if they want to embrace or reject the death penalty. I remember clearly the fear I had in losing the death penalty, thinking about that. I wasn't being tried, but just thinking of the world without the death penalty, for the simple reason that at that point in my life, it was only probably, 19 or 20 years old, the thought of creating massive storage units, buildings, prisons, full of people that have committed murder, I just did the logic. I said, my fear is that at some point, this is going to start to build up and overflow. These facilities are going to fill up, and countries, what do they do when that happens? Well, they develop a tolerance. They start letting people out. Hey, this guy's been well behaved, or this guy doesn't, or we can't put people in jail that long. We just don't have the space. It becomes a business monetary issue. Government budgets begin to get bloated, as they are right now. And what happens? Liberal philosophy begins to creep in and release many of these murderers back into society. And it turns out my fears were spot on. Today I'm going to take you through an article by Liberty University, which I think is going to help you and I more clearly understand the exact what the Bible says about the death penalty. Greetings, everybody. My name is Stevie Garofalo. This is Reason for Truth, where the truth comes first and the reasons come last, but we're always and constantly learning, because when we stop learning, we stop teaching, or at least stop teaching well. You know, this is the channel and the organization that helps you, both Christians and non-Christians, cut through the fog of culture's distorted truth. Certainly hear the truth about the death penalty, because in our relative world, the truth doesn't change, but the human will to distort it certainly does, and that's what's happened with the death penalty. Today I want to cut through the distortion of these current events. When I mean current events, the last few decades, 5 decades, with the truth as an antidote to the false messages that we're hearing in the media, so pervasive in today's world. Before we get started, as you know what I say, hit the old Gancio Sinistro, boom, left hook, right hook, subscribe button, and then join my community. Put a little note, StephenGarofalo.com. It's free. In an article by BBC News, before we jump into the Liberty article, this article on BBC News titled Killers Who Go On to Kill Again Under the Spotlight, published January 19th of 2022. It's just published in the UK, not here in America. This is what the little blurb from the article said. This: over 30 killers killed again after being freed to prison between 2000 and 2010. I guess 1st of 2000 and then November of 2010. Statistics show figures released by the Home Office showed that 29 people with homicide convictions went on to commit murder, and 6 went on to commit manslaughter. Now, I'm going to pause there for a minute. When they say they went on, that's not a true statement. I'll tell you why. The only people that they know that committed murder a second time were those who were caught, and most of the time they're not caught. So if you say, hey, we convicted 1,000 murderers, only 100 were recidivists, well, how do you know how many murdered and just weren't caught? And I guarantee you that number is substantial. Even if it's not substantial, it still exists, but I think it's substantial in most cases. The government says it does all it can to protect the public from offenders, but sadly, risk can never be eliminated entirely, the article went on to say. Now, the report comes as a number of killings were kind of happening there in the UK, and police recorded in England and Wales that rose 600 to 636 in the 12 months to March 2011, up from 608 the previous year. That leads us back to ask the age-old question is, what is the death penalty, or why is it biblical, I should say? Well, welcome back to part 2, addressing the question as to the rightful or wrongful nature of the death penalty, and is it biblical? And as stated before, there are many conclusions as there are opinions, and that if I had 100 people in the room, there'd be 100 opinions that seemingly end with 100 different conclusions, but there can only be one truth. And today's episode is going to just rest on one opinion, and that opinion is God's opinion, as laid out in scriptures of the Holy Bible. That's really where an eye for an eye and a tooth came from, right? Well, the Bible makes clear throughout Romans 13 that government was established as an avenger that carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. And with the biblical view of government, Christians can promote the death penalty as directed by God. In an article published March 1st, 2021 by Keaton Browder, entitled Christians and the Death Penalty, Browder addressed the issue of the death penalty. This is the Liberty article I told you about. And Browder notes that it has long been a constant debate among Christians that one-sided justified capital punishment from its biblical origins as retribution of wrongdoing. Now, while others argue against the practice, maintaining its holistic pro-life stance. So it's going to show you kind of both parts of the coin. Now, the death penalty is advocated for, it is in the Bible, for Christians should not support the existing death penalty model. That's his position. He thinks it's somewhat flawed, but he kind of takes a position as well that death penalty is still very biblical if administered correctly. He says that there's current inconsistencies in the system and discrepancies with offenders. Cases should cause Christians to stop blindly encouraging the policy. Christians must first retain our pro-life and human rights stance before we can promote the poor implemented capital punishment model we currently have in place today. I think it is time for an updated model for our death penalty, because what we certainly don't want to do is put anybody to death that is innocent. But by the same token, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater and have no capital punishment when we see people that are clearly convicted and there's just really no doubt as to they did commit this heinous crime. For example, someone's caught on video murdering a police officer. Really, do you think they might not have done it? And then there's eyewitnesses and videos, and let's say the police officer witnessed it, and the gun and the ballistics match up. Those cases happen every day, those types of things. And for those cases, I think that we can implement the death penalty. The concept of capital punishment, he goes to write, was established in Genesis 9:6. That's what he wrote. And it said, quoting 9:6, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. We covered that part 2, as well as Romans 13:4 specifically discusses the concept of government authority, mandating the instruction, the rulers does not bear the sword in vain. We talked about that as well. These verses outline that government has the God-granted right to punish wrongdoers. We don't. There's no such thing as revenge that's either right in God's eyes or the government's eyes, which includes implementation of the death penalty. We don't have that right. New Testament principles of love and forgiveness apply to Christians, but not primarily to governments and authority. The Bible makes it clear, though, that throughout Romans 13, the government was established by an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. You want to be careful what you wish for. If you keep wishing that we do away with the death penalty altogether, you might end up with a very lawless society, as we are really in right now in many cases. But with that biblical view of government, Christians can promote the death penalty, he writes, as directed by God. There is a problem, however, in that Christians must tread lightly on the issue of capital punishment. On one hand, it's biblically mandated for the government, but problems such as racism, possibly of wrongful convictions, corrupt present systems, and I would say even aggressive, prosecutors who just want to get it. A lot of times I think they want to win the case more than they want to find the truth. But the argument for capital punishment should first be met by proper implementation. And on the contrary, Christians have a bigger problem to solve than really ensuring capital punishment's place in government. This is what he's writing. He says, before promoting the policy's use, Christians should be aware of the rights, violations, and discrepancies that contaminate the current capital punishment system. It'd be interesting. I think Liberty would be very able to help be part of rewriting, at least part of the dialogue, to rewrite the capital punishment rules, and then it could be implemented more widely, more deeply, and more swiftly. Dr. Norman Geisler taught us in ethics. He said if the death penalty was administered rightfully, swiftly, and widely, murder would decrease overnight. It really would. I believe it would. People wouldn't, if they knew you're going to face death, people would, they'd think twice before they kill somebody, before they murder somebody. And the article goes on to say, innocent lives have been lost to the death penalty. The prominent issue of capital punishment is killing an innocent person that was wrongfully convicted. Since 1973, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, over 185 mistakenly convicted prisoners on death row have been exonerated, pointing to a trend of erroneous death sentences. Similarly, more wrongfully convicted detainees have most likely been put to death. There have been dozens of instances in capital cases where there were discrepancies and questionable convictions. But Christians cannot ignore these cases and vouch for capital punishment they can, but not without acknowledging this problem. Now, I can't think of anything more horrible than being put to death when you're innocent. That is egregious. So we have to be careful, and that's what this article is advocating for. And it goes on to say another caveat for the continued implementation of the death penalty is the racist tendencies of conviction. If victims of a crime is white, the offender is more likely to be sentenced to death. Cases involving white victims comprise 80% of all capital cases, according to reports from the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, in which African American offenders are 3 times more likely to receive the death penalty than white individuals. Now, I don't buy the argument either that any race is put to death because of their color. He goes on to say, how can Christians support a process with racist outcomes? He says, I agree with that. Totally agree with that. Christians should be on the offense, though, in stopping racial disparities. Public policy with unjust results is not God ordained. Amen. I think a lot of times we have to make sure, listen, there's a lot of good black folk out there, a lot of good white folk, Asian, Hispanic. Good folk are good folk. They come in all colors, so they're bad people, right? We have to make sure we don't judge someone on their color. God created all men and women equal. It doesn't matter what color you are, what country, what continent. If you're a man or a woman, human race, you are equal. We are all equal with one another. So with these misnomers, Christians have the responsibility to promote solutions to these inconsistencies before we begin to encourage the death penalty with a fair, just system, before capital punishment can be justified as biblical. We must follow our pro-innocent life stance and fight against the sin of racism. We must fight to ensure innocence until proven guilty. It's a well-written article. After these problems are solved, Christians could then justifiably encourage the biblical use of the death penalty. Great article. Keaton Browder, opinion piece. I think he did a great job on it. But in the end, I would say that I think we can take that, the political, and that's a little bit political, but it's also a little bit true. I think if you looked at the death penalty as implemented years ago, there wasn't all the DNA and there wasn't all the awareness of wrongful convictions. And there was racism, and that certainly did entail putting a lot of black people, probably very much so, more so than white people, on death row. And it's a good thing that we're sifting through that. And that's just a shame. But I think in today's world here forward, we can't say that, we have to look at the evidence. I think people today, for the most parts of the United States, I could say pretty clearly, I don't really think that's the case anymore. I think that there are certainly cases of it, and of putting more people of color in, that might happen. But I think for the most part, I think with the advent of technology, DNA, and all the different new advents in technology that we're seeing, that go by the wayside. In the end, you can't just say, hey, that happens, and therefore we're not going to use the death penalty. What we need to do here is make the death penalty more accurate, more biblical. By biblical, we have to make sure that we have enough evidence. They didn't have DNA. They didn't have cameras back in the time of Jesus. But we have to follow the spirit of what was being saying. It was 2 witnesses. But that meant something different back in the day than it does today. And I think that we need to, we have to make sure that we're being fair to people, that we are treating people fairly, and that but at the same token, we are making sure that we get people that are pretty egregious and they've been convicted very clearly of the death penalty. Death penalty needs to come forward. You don't really rehabilitate murderers in most cases. Some cases you do, but it's very rare. And I think they can always be rehabilitated before God. But in the reality of life, we want to make sure we don't put culture into a place where we have 1 million murderers locked up, where we have 1 million murderers on the loose. And certainly, if you want to talk about what is a murder, that's a different episode. End of the day, if you'd enjoyed today's content, would like to learn more, go to equippedacademy.com. That's where you're going to get some great online training. Enjoy my community at StephenGarofalo.com. I'm your host, Stephen Garofalo, with this is your Reason for Truth for today.